In this way, as Einstein showed, even when there is apparently no rope or physical medium to transmit our waves, we can still be sure that there must be, by the geometric principle, some physical medium there, just as the ether physicists suspected all along. This is clear in his later, heavily dismissed work when he said, for example, "But even if these possibilities should mature into genuine theories, we will not be able to do without the ether in theoretical physics, i.e. a continuum, which is equipped with physical properties. For the general theory of relativity, whose basic points of view surely will always maintain, excludes direct distant action. But every contiguous action theory presumes continuous fields, and therefore also the existence of an ether." And, even more specifically, Einstein said, state of the metric tensor equals ether, where the metric tensor is the localized measure of distances and angles, geometry, that lives native to an approximation space, tangent at every point, and equal therewith the real higher dimensional geometric manifold that is spacetime. Let's talk about the force of gravity, or rather, the phenomenon of falling. The second law of motion is the force law. It equates the vector of force with a vector of acceleration, and declares that force is a vector, a little arrow possessing both a measurable magnitude and direction. This means we accelerate during the process of falling. However, if we fall far enough, we seem to stop falling, achieving a resting frame of motion in our own experience. If a box were then placed around us, and we were to go about in it, we'd feel weightlessness and no forces on us at all.
Try to do a front foot impossible. I did it!
How can we explain this free fall? When Einstein pioneered the general theory of relativity, he turned vectors into tensors and the vector space into a manifold, and gave us the answer, which we can summarize as one of the three big-picture takeaways of general relativity. Firstly is the reality of a material space-time, the physical vacuum, and secondly is the disappearance of time, as we have already seen. Thirdly, however, is the disappearance of gravity, and, by implication, the other forces as geometries of space-time. In other words, there is no gravity. There is only the geometry of a four-dimensional containing medium whose intrinsic contours determine the geodesics or embedded curves followed by the paths of objects. This is just like in the two-dimensional case, where our contours were determined by the gradient vector of the generating function. Since, by general relativity, the force of gravitation is equivalent to the acceleration of falling, and because this force disappears, there is no gravitational force. There is only the geometry of this higher dimensional containing material. Similarly, as we'll see by the end of this video, we could likewise incorporate the other fundamental forces in this framework, and consider them all as the effects of different curvatures of a single fundamental substrate. Since before he published his general theory to the day of his death, Einstein's attempts at generalizing his theory still further always involved treating the curvature and torsion of the material vacuum of space-time as a complete unified description of the gravitational and electromagnetic fields. He was convinced that a gravitational theory that employed only the curvature to be only half correct. This dissatisfaction with this theory would begin not long after Cartan's identification of the antisymmetric part of an asymmetric affine connection with the torsion tensor in 1922. In 1950, in the supplement to his final editions of his book The Meaning of Relativity, Einstein said, "The first problem is, how can the field structure be generalized in a natural way? Which is the natural generalization of the symmetrical metric tensor? The solution which comes immediately to mind is the substitution of the symmetrical tensor field by a non-symmetrical one." Let's look also at his final blackboard, which is described in popular videos like this one in the same cryptic way, as just an attempt to incorporate the antisymmetric connection to the semi-Riemannian manifold of spacetime. It's interesting to watch the reactions of these physicists, unwilling to say more here when asked how this work is not clearly related to the contemporaneous work of Cartan and Torsion. So let's now be forthcoming in a way these physicists appear unwilling to. The specific geometry enabled by an antisymmetric connection on a manifold is the torsion, as pioneered by Élie Cartan, otherwise known as Élie Cartan, when he identified it, literally inventing it in his foundational papers from way back in 1922, work that was obsessed over by Einstein for a full 30 years. As we see on his blackboard, he knew from his own independent invention of the torsion tensor that the torsion is the natural counterpart to the classical curvature used already in general relativity. With spacetime torsion, we can have not only the smooth, curved spacetime of general relativity, but also the folded, wrinkled, and fractal spacetime whose unique geometry is measurable not by a curvature tensor, but by a torsion tensor.
There ain't no little airplane that moves 5 miles in 2 seconds.
I know, that's what it means.
But it's moving more than 5 miles. It moved over that part of the sky there. It probably moved 500. It probably moved 100 miles in a matter of a second or two.
As we have seen, a large solid object like Tim Edwards' cylinder jumping great distances with no respect to an inertial frame, skipping the entire acceleration phase of its change in velocity, and negating any inertial stopping forces on it, totally violates the laws of conventional aerodynamics. Because acceleration is equivalent to a change in direction, instantaneous acceleration encompasses things like instantaneous turning and stopping. According to general relativity, force acceleration is equivalent to gravity as space-time curvature. Thus, as should now be clear, instantaneous acceleration in an object can only be induced by the local manipulation of the space-time curvature around it. Though global manipulation of gravity by its typical curvature is probably impossible without unmanageably large amounts of matter or imaginary exotic matter, there is another, suspiciously buried but totally valid form of gravity that is likely engineerable, to borrow a phrase from Dr. Joseph Farrell. In the Einstein-Cartan framework of gravity, the natural counterpart to spacetime curvature, the torsion, is enabled by an antisymmetric connection. With any material object, without stretching or tearing it, there are only two things we can do to it. We can curve it, which is only realized globally, or we can twist it, which takes place at some point locally. This is just like a freshly washed blanket. We can now either fold it, or we can leave it in a crumpled, wrinkled, and locally twisted mess. Using this point of view in higher dimensions, we can measure the wrinkles and folds of space-time using the torsion tensor. Just as the mass of matter induces curvature in space-time by the gravitational or Einstein field equation, phenomena like the Einstein-de Haas effect suggest that the spin of matter induces torsion in space-time, similar to how a spinning ball placed in water generates a vortex. Thus, we have a torsion form of the gravitational or Einstein field equation that is its natural analog. Given this totally natural analogy between curvature and torsion in space-time, and through the foundational work of Gabriel Krohn and other physicists, mathematicians, and engineers, to point out the non-Riemannian, torsion-enabled geometry of rotating electrical machinery, we know that, if this analogy is true, this localized torsional gravity is totally engineerable by the appropriate configuration of highly energized rotating electrified machinery or similar apparatus that achieves the manipulation of its particle spin. In the words of eminent English physicist Dennis Sciama, The idea that spin gives rise to torsion should not be regarded as an ad hoc modification of general relativity. On the contrary, it has a deep group theoretical and geometric basis. If the history had been reversed and the spin of the electron discovered before 1915, I have little doubts that Einstein would have wanted to include torsion in his original formulation of general relativity. Now let's come back to Bob Lazar. The most telling interview ever given about Lazar was that of Christopher Mellon on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Well, I found his explanations curious.
Yeah, how so?
The complexity of it, and the fact that he talked about Laurentium, for example.
I found his explanations curious because of their level of complexity, yet he knew about element 115. What Mellon meant by this is that, from the point of view of someone in the loop about the gravitational propulsion research conducted at Groom Lake, Lazar's explanations were curiously lacking in detail and complexity. Although he was aware of a legitimate potential method of gravitational propulsion using element 115. Now, this lies at the heart of Lazar's claim, beyond the hype, the potential legitimacy of the method of propulsion he would know about as a self-proclaimed alien back engineer. Let's dig into Lazar's science for a minute so we can see not only what it says about him, but also about the Earthling-engineered general property that all so-called gravitational devices, like that of Thomas Townsend Brown or William Wallace and the patent that follows, are exploiting. Let's examine the infamous patent upon which Lazar's claims are based. United States Patent Number 3,626,605. Method and apparatus for generating a secondary gravitational force field. Henry William Wallace, December 14th, 1971. Apparatus and method for generating a time-variant non-electromagnetic force field due to the dynamic interaction of relatively moving bodies and for transforming such force fields into energy for doing useful work. The method of generating such time-variant force fields, including the steps of juxtaposing in-field series relationship, a stationary member of spin nuclei material, and a member capable of assuming relative motion with respect to said stationary member, also characterized by spin nuclei material, initiating relative motion by rotation of said one member with respect to the other, which rotational motion may occur both about an axis within the plane of said other member and about an axis perpendicular thereto, whereby the rotational motion of said one member about the axis perpendicular to the plane of said other member results in the dual interaction of the angular momentum property of said one member with inertial space and also with respect to the angular momentum property of said other member, thereby resulting in a dynamic interaction field arising through gravitational coupling, which dynamic interaction field is further characterized by its non-electromagnetic nature and its mass proximity and relative motion dependency. The rotation of said one member about the axis within the plane of said other member, further resulting in an undulation of the dynamic interaction field within said other member, which in turn gives rise to a secondary time-variant gravitational field in the surrounding space. First of all, hey William, have you heard of periods? Have you heard of sentences?
One man's garbage, another person's good on garbage.
In the practice of the present invention, it has been found that when bodies composed of certain material are placed in relative motion with respect to one another, there is generated an energy field therein not heretofore observed. This field is not electromagnetic in nature, being by theoretical prediction related to the gravitational coupling of relatively moving bodies. The inventor, a Mr. Henry William Wallace, describes the induction of a secondary localized gravitational force field by the coupling of tightly knit spinning bodies. Does that sound familiar? It's important to realize that, as abstruse as his descriptions are, he does not put forth a physical mechanism for such a phenomenon to occur. For example, in the all-important quote from this document, Wallace states that, since the dynamic interaction field arising through gravitational coupling is a function of both the mass and proximity of two relatively moving bodies, then the resultant force field is predictably maximized within the nucleus of an atom due to the relatively high densities of the nucleons, plus the fact that the nucleons possess both intrinsic and orbital components of angular momentum, or spin. Such force fields may in fact account for a significant portion of the nuclear binding or strong force found in all of nature. We'll come back to this quote, but just know here how he never mentions how this field is maximized. Of course, this is because he already knew of the mechanism, as it has been known since the days of Einstein and Cartan. Torsion physics, namely the torsion of space-time by way of its coupling to intrinsic particle spin, a manipulable and engineerable property of matter. This is revealed in this patent at the outset, when Wallace declares his induced force field is a secondary gravitational field. Here, instead of listening to any person, let's take differential geometry as the authority on these matters, when it describes the secondary field of curvature from the development of plane curves to its extension on a manifold of any dimension as the torsion. In this way, the torsion physics of space-time, literally defined as localized gravity in any form, lies at the heart of all so-called anti-gravity devices. A further desirable characteristic of this mass circuit is that it have a capability for mass flow with respect to the undulating kinemassic field structure. Mercury has the desired combination of properties, and while other materials may be used, mercury is the most effective thus far known. Here, Wallace is describing the use of rotating liquid mercury as a mass circuit, the part of the device that will manipulate particle spin and thus induce gravity. How exactly mercury, bismuth, or element 115 are related as bodies of certain material is a complicated matter that we will leave to the viewer to decipher. Suffice it to say, they are related, given that a stable isotope of element 115 exists. That this is the function of the non-stationary mass circuit is revealed, for example, when Wallace describes, and I quote again, "The nucleons possess both intrinsic and orbital components of angular momentum." Now, the trained physicist might object on the grounds that quantized spin is a more abstract property than its orbital counterpart, to which I would refer them to the abstract of Han Ohanian's 1984 publication, What is Spin?, which nicely summarizes this situation as follows. According to the prevailing belief, the spin of the electron or of some other particle is a mysterious internal angular momentum for which no concrete physical picture is available, and for which there is no classical analog. However, on the basis of an old calculation by Belinfante, Physica 6, 887, 1939, it can be shown that the spin may be regarded as an angular momentum generated by a circulating flow of energy in the wave field of the electron. Likewise, the magnetic moment may be regarded as generated by a circulating flow of charge in the wave field. This produces an intuitively appealing picture and establishes that neither the spin nor the magnetic moment are internal. They are not associated with the internal structure of the electron, but rather with the structure of its wave field. Furthermore, a comparison between calculations of angular momentum in the Dirac and electromagnetic fields shows that the spin of the electron is entirely analogous to the angular momentum carried by a classical, circularly polarized wave. If spin is taken as a real sort of rotational freedom, then it is certainly the case for the electron that its circulating energy field is that of a rotating electromagnetic field. On the origin of interpreting quantum mechanical spin as merely mathematical representations of rotations in three-space, Ohanian continues, when Gaudsmit and Uhlenbeck proposed the hypothesis of the spin of the electron, they had in mind a mechanical picture of the electron as a small rigid body rotating about its axis. Such a picture had earlier been considered by Kronig and discarded on the advice of Pauli, Kramers, and Heisenberg, who deemed it a fatal flaw of this picture that the speed of rotation calculated from the magnitude of the spin and a plausible estimate of the radius of the electron was in excess of the speed of light. However, the great success of the spin hypothesis in explaining the Zeeman effect and the doublet structure of spectral lines quickly led to its acceptance. Since the naive mechanical picture of spin proved untenable, physicists were left with the concept of spin minus its physical basis, like the grin of the Cheshire Cat. If we take it as true, as in Ohanian's hypothesis, that intrinsic spin is also rotational, then by the non-Riemannian geometry of rotating electromagnetic fields and the rotating electromagnetic field of the circulating wave field of the electron, then we have the explicit physical link between torsion and spin in a Riemann-Cartan spacetime by the same natural logic that explains mass causing curvature. Just as a liquid metal curves around an immersed object to accommodate it, spacetime curves around mass, or rather the four-dimensional stress energy of mass. In the same way, just as a viscous fluid will spin along with a spinning object placed within it, it is just geometrical common sense that spacetime locally twists around the spin of tiny objects like electrons. Quoting once more, the resultant force field is predictably maximized within the nucleus of an atom due to the relatively high densities of the nucleons. Here, in discussing superheavy nucleons, Wallace answers the question of what the most effective stationary mass circuit would be, which tells us two things. Firstly, the device described by Wallace, if you can decipher his paragraph-long opening run-on sentence, is one that takes stationary matter of a certain material and spins around it a fluid of certain other material, both characterized, just like ferromagnetic materials, as having unstable nuclei spin and or high mass density. Since the only thing that is occurring here is the modification of the spin of the involved materials, and although Wallace does not deign to tell us exactly why, this somehow generates a secondary gravitational field, and we are left only with one physical basis upon which to explain this phenomenon, the torsion physics of spacetime, which predicts this very effect. Do you finally see what patents like this are really telling us? Behind the device, there is a science here, one that only becomes more and more profound as we travel deeper down the rabbit hole. As we have seen, while there are no doubt back engineering programs as revealed by CIA insiders earlier this month, there is also 70 years worth of gravitational propulsion and vacuum energy technologies, advanced government research, that has been concealed from not only other members of the aviation industry, but also throughout government and academia. While arguments will be made that such research is proprietary, the use of public funding may confer a liability of disclosure by the involved aviation companies. What is it that must make this science concealed? What is it about it that is so literally earth-shattering? That we are now awakening to the presence of other human-like beings using this same gravitational technology is no mere coincidence. It marks, in fact, a pivotal moment in our species' development, one defined and predicted by evolutionary law.